Adrian Newey will soon reveal what he does next after leaving Red Bull in 2025, and one of his potential F1 destinations is Ferrari. If he ends up behind a new desk at Maranello, it will be a case of the Prancing Horse finally getting its man at the 4th attempt. It will come as no surprise that one of the greatest car designers in the history of motorsport has been approached by one of the world's greatest car manufacturers on multiple occasions, but it's astonishing to think Ferrari's pursuit of Newey has lasted on and off for the best part of 40 years. The Italian team first tried to recruit Newey as far back as 1985, when he was an up-and-coming IndyCar designer and race engineer, while Ferrari was threatening to quit F1. Ferrari was struggling in F1's first turbo-engined era, arguing with the FIA over new engine rules coming for 1989, and so team founder Enzo Ferrari turned his gaze stateside. A newly designed March 85C made it to Maranello as Ferrari geared up to return to the Indy 500 for the first time since 1952, while Newey himself made what he called a clandestine visit to Maranello as Ferrari pushed to make Newey the chief designer for its IndyCar project, a car that famously never raced. But ultimately, Newey turned Ferrari down. A similar thing happened around 10 years later. In the mid-1990s, future FIA president Jean Todt was in the process of renewing Ferrari's F1 team after a decade of World Championship failure. He flew Newey out to Italy and offered to make him Ferrari's new technical director on what Newey called very attractive terms. Todt also revealed Ferrari's plans to sign reigning world champion Michael Schumacher. Newey has differing recollections of this approach. On F1's official podcast, he recounts being approached by Ferrari just after Todt joined the team, which would suggest Ferrari made contact in the second half of 1993. But in his excellent book, How to Build a Car, Newey places Todt's proposal within the timeline of the 1995 season, when Newey's Williams contract was up for renewal and McLaren was also trying to sign him. It's possible there were two separate approaches, of course, and that maybe the earlier one was less formal, or perhaps Newey misremembered the precise timeline when asked on Beyond the Grid, but it amounts to the same thing regardless. The new Todt regime was persistent in its attempts to recruit Newey to lead Ferrari's F1 revival. In any case, having designed the Williams FW16 in which Ayrton Senna was killed at Imola the previous year, Newey was cautious about working with Schumacher. He said he would have found it almost disrespectful to work with Schumacher so soon after Senna's death, recalling comments Senna had made about being convinced Schumacher's Benetton was using illegal traction control in those early races of 1994. Concerned also about uprooting his family to Italy, Newey considered an alternative proposal from Martin Whitmarsh to become McLaren's technical director, but in the end chose to sign a new 3-year contract with Williams on improved terms. Of course, Newey did eventually join McLaren in time to design its championship-winning 1998 car before moving to Red Bull in 2006 and helping transform that startup operation into one of current F1's true powerhouse teams. 2014 was not a happy time to be at Red Bull, unless your name was Daniel Ricciardo. While the Honey Badger was enjoying his breakthrough F1 season, bloodying the nose of 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel and claiming his first 3 F1 victories, Adrian Newey was becoming seriously disillusioned. Already perturbed by chassis regulations he felt were becoming increasingly restrictive, closing off areas like elastic aero, exhaust blown diffusers and interconnected suspension that had proved fruitful for Red Bull in the past, Newey also disliked F1's move away from normally aspirated V8 engines to V6 turbo hybrids. As Mercedes began dominating this new era with an engine so far ahead of the competition that technical executive Paddy Lowe later admitted on F1's official podcast it had to be deliberately detuned in qualifying to avoid embarrassing the opposition, Newey felt F1 had become engine dominated and that this was not a good thing. But the main source of Newey's disgruntlement specifically was Renault's terrible engine, which lacked power, reliability and the innovative technologies required of this new formula. Renault's shortcomings transformed Red Bull overnight from a serial championship winner to a title race no-hoper, capable of winning only occasional races that Mercedes let slip through its fingers. Newey, being at heart a racer with a fierce competitive streak, simply couldn't abide this new reality. In his book, Newey describes the spring of 2014 as a bit of a crunch decision time. An emergency meeting with Renault president Carlos Ghosn left Newey feeling even more depressed about Red Bull's chances of turning things around. Newey, team boss Christian Horner and Red Bull advisor Helmut Marko all went to see Ghosn to try to get him to up Renault's spend on the F1 engine project. Newey said the feedback Red Bull had been getting from Viry was that Renault's F1 engine needed more people and more money, but when they tried to apply some pressure, Ghosn told them Renault was only in Formula 1 for marketing reasons. As for the alternatives, Well, there weren't any. Honda was still the best part of a year from rejoining F1 and anyway had an exclusive deal with McLaren. Newey says Red Bull knew Mercedes wouldn't supply an engine for fear of being beaten by a car with their own engine in it. And Newey himself had instigated Red Bull's original switch from Ferrari to Renault customer engines in 2007 because he felt certain Red Bull couldn't count on equal equipment should Ferrari find itself up against Red Bull in a title fight. Out of desperation, Red Bull even considered building its own engines, but that option was ruled out on account of what Newey called the colossal investment required. Of course, Red Bull is now building its own engines for F1's new power unit regulations coming in 2026, but back in 2014, this option was considered untenable. So Newey was, to all intents and purposes, stuck with what was likely to remain inferior Renault engines for what he called some huge amount of time in the future, leaving him feeling pretty disillusioned with the whole thing. In fact, Renault has competed with a power deficit for pretty much the entirety of F1's hybrid era so far, and is now gearing up to shut down its F1 engine programme entirely, so Newey was probably right to feel concerned about the timeline for Renault to get its act together. This pushed Newey to start considering his own options. He later admitted he didn't really want to switch teams. Red Bull was like a family to him, and he said leaving would feel like walking out on your wife, but the Renault situation was causing him to lose motivation. This is when late Mercedes executive chairman Niki Lauda stepped in. Having played a key role in recruiting Lewis Hamilton from McLaren for 2013, Lauda clearly felt he could sweet-talk Newey into bolstering Mercedes' newly dominant operation. Newey says Lauda even paid him a couple of home visits in a bid to convince him to join, but Newey says the move, though tempting, didn't feel right, so he turned Lauda down. The prospect of Newey bolstering what anyway turned out to be an incredible run of championship success between 2014 and 2021 is difficult to comprehend. It speaks to Newey's innate will to win that he seriously considered the offer, but as his comment about feeling like a trophy hunter attests, Newey also loves a challenge. Moving to Mercedes back then would likely have made life just a bit too easy. While Newey was contemplating his own future amid Renault's horrible slump, Ferrari was busy dealing with a horrendous downturn of its own. The 2014 car was its first winless design since 1993, and like Renault, the Italian manufacturer underestimated the shift to turbo hybrid engines, building a power unit that was overweight and fuel-thirsty. As lead driver Fernando Alonso grew increasingly irate, so the traditional process of scapegoating inside Maranello was well underway. Long-serving team principal Stefano Domenicali stepped down just 3 lacklustre races into the new season, and engine chief Luca Marmarini would be gone by the summer, paving the way for one Mattia Binotto to take over Ferrari's F1 engine project. Meanwhile, company president Luca de Montezemolo, himself soon heading for the exit door, made an audacious play to land Newey's signature. Newey says he visited de Montezemolo at the Ferrari president's farmhouse close to Tuscany and held serious talks over an amazing offer. Newey says Ferrari was prepared to hand over technical control of its entire road and race car operation, and more than double Newey's Red Bull salary to make it happen. Presumably, this would have effectively made Newey Ferrari's chief technical officer, with then technical director James Allison reporting into him. This offer wasn't quite so easy to turn down as the Mercedes one had been. Although Newey only entertained these discussions with Ferrari purely out of frustration, he admitted the subsequent offer gave him a very difficult decision to make that cost him many nights' sleep. But in the end, Newey turned Ferrari down for a 3rd time. Even though he was fed up with Red Bull's predicament in F1, his paternal love for a team he'd helped build and turn from what he called a paddock joke into a multiple World Championship winning outfit was simply too strong. At the same time, Newey was also pushing for his own position within Red Bull to change. On Sunday, June 8th, 2014, the day of Daniel Ricciardo's first F1 victory in the Canadian Grand Prix, Red Bull announced Newey had signed a new multi-year contract. That evening, I asked new Ferrari team boss Marco Mattiacci directly about Ferrari's failed attempts to poach Newey, but he flat out denied they'd been trying to sign him. Meanwhile, Red Bull team boss Christian Horner proudly confirmed Newey would continue to advise and mentor his team and mentioned exciting new projects that will be announced in due course. Newey reiterated his dislike of F1's restrictive regulations and said he'd like to try his hand at different things. He would spend the summer helping Red Bull restructure its technical leadership before stepping back into an advisory role. It sounded like semi-retirement, but rather than lose the benefit of Newey's genius completely, Horner wisely decided to let Newey go off and do whatever he wanted to do next, while effectively retaining him as F1's most valuable technical consultant. Newey spent roughly half of his working time on the F1 side of Red Bull's operation, and the rest of it on getting a new company called Red Bull Advanced Technologies up and running. This is the vehicle that allowed Newey to apply his creativity to Ben Ainsley's America's Cup yacht racing project and then design the Aston Martin Valkyrie. Newey said it had been one of his childhood ambitions to design a road-going sports car, so the Cosworth V12-powered Aston was the realisation of that dream. It also kept him occupied while buying more time for Red Bull's F1 team to find a more competitive engine partner. Newey's final Red Bull, the RB17 launched at Goodwood's Festival of Speed in the summer of 2024, runs along similar lines to the Aston. These projects have been Red Bull's way of keeping Newey's restless creative brain engaged enough to stick around Milton Keynes rather than wandering off completely whenever he's become frustrated or bored with F1, and they have also stopped him being poached by a rival. When Red Bull eventually linked up with Honda Power for 2019, Newey was able to finally set the long-running Renault nightmare aside and rediscover some of his former enthusiasm and motivation. He became increasingly present on the F1 side of Red Bull as World Championships became a realistic possibility and then a reality again. But in 2025, after almost 20 years of incredible success, Newey finally leaves Red Bull for good.